But tonight, we have Jonathan Williams from the American Legislative Exchange Council. And for some of you, you maybe know all about ALEC, but I'll have to confess my ignorance. I did not know of that organization. I do know of several of the people who are prominent within that organization. Probably most of you are familiar with Arthur Laffer of the Laffer Curve, as well as Stephen Moore from the Wall Street Journal. Anyhow, Jonathan has collaborated with those two and produced this work every year. This is the 4th edition of Rich States, Poor States. And they're back there on the table, and they are for you to take free of charge tonight on the way out, as well as this handbook for state lawmakers. So, I don't know, if you're thinking about being a state lawmaker, I hope some of you are. We need people to run for office. Feel free to help yourself to that literature as well as some other things. One of the things we have on the back table, if you didn't see it, is a little synopsis of Lowell Kalapa's presentation last week. Basically, we did that through, I don't know how many of you saw the front page article in West Hawaii Today after he was here and spoke. Anybody? Okay, well, if you didn't, we've got excerpts of it on there that you can take with you to go. Tonight's meeting is sponsored by the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii and Smart Business Hawaii, which is Sam Sloan's organization, as well as the Kona Tea Party. So kudos to them for making this happen. Our next meeting will be on February the 2nd. Planning to have a lunch meeting with Jennifer Marshall from the Heritage Foundation. And she will be coming, and she is their expert on educational issues. So we're going to be changing gears a little bit and bringing another issue that's very important to us here in Hawaii. Is that right?
Yes.
So particularly, there's probably a lot of people that, that want to come for the economic issues, but I'll bet you know a lot of moms and stuff out there who would like to come and hear about the educational issues, and this gal knows what she's talking about. So that's going to be February 2nd. It's going to be a lunch meeting. We're going to try to have it at Basil's downtown, but that's not confirmed yet. We'll send out the email and all that kind of thing to let you know. But what we do know is it will be February 2nd. It will be Jennifer Marshall from the Heritage Foundation on education. Jonathan Williams from the American Legislative Exchange Council. Jonathan, why don't you come on up? I'll bet you have something for Jonathan. Make sure you get these.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. My pleasure. Greetings from the land of make-believe, Washington, D.C. It's good to be out in America, outside of the Beltway, where it's not dangerous to drink the drinking water. And so it's great to be back in the great state of Hawaii. This is my second time here. I was here last April to meet with legislators and speak to the legislature there in Honolulu, and had a fantastic time, and was in about 2 days and then back to DC. So this time we extended the trip a little bit, and this time I brought along my lovely and talented fiance Katja, who's in the back there. Why don't you wave to everybody, Katja? It's been great to have her with me this trip and get to explore the islands a little bit. First time here on the Big Island, so this is fantastic, and look forward to spending the weekend here and seeing the sights and really enjoying it. I don't know how many here have heard of ALEC before. I would assume that a gentleman with the ALEC shirt on may know something or another about the organization. And so usually when we go out to groups that are not legislative groups, even conservative groups, not a lot of folks know what ALEC is all about. It's really the nation's conservative group of state legislators out there today. We've been around since 1973. And we exist to promote the Jeffersonian policies of low taxes, limited government, individual liberty, and that thing known as federalism that we don't know anything about in Washington. Who here knows that the 10th Amendment was not written just to add words to the Constitution? Right? Okay. Well, in D.C. we've forgotten that, and we have, what we know as the Interstate Commerce Clause, by which we justify every conceivable federal government intervention into the states. Where our founders certainly thought that the states ought to exist as 50 somewhat autonomous laboratories of democracy, that by which we can judge the relative success or lack of success of public policy. And of course, we've drifted far away from that. Now, our organization, though, does focus on the 50 states. We do have a little over 100 members of the U.S. Congress who are ALEC alumni members when they served in their various state legislative chambers. And in fact, Congressman Charles Jew here from Hawaii was an ALEC member when he was in the state legislature. We were glad to have him out in Washington for a time. Maybe he'll be coming back at some point. Of course, this is a nonpartisan message tonight. We're a 501c3 nonpartisan, non-political organization. We stick to the policy, and that's what ALEC is about. And you can go to our website. We've got the website pulled up here tonight. It's alec.org. You can look at all of our publications. You can read more about what we're doing in the 50 states. I brought a few publications to talk about tonight, one of which is going to be the theme of the presentation, and that's Rich States, Poor States. This is a book that I do every year with Arthur Laffer and Steve Moore at the Wall Street Journal, and those are all available on the back table. We're going to have everybody hopefully take one or two on the way out, and if you know somebody that's really interested in this topic of economic reform and competitiveness, please take an extra one with you. We've also got, as Rick mentioned, the Article 5 handbook for state legislators on how to produce a quality balanced budget amendment to the United States Constitution, which is obviously something sorely needed, considering that any of you follow the U.S. debt clock, the website where you see the numbers going faster than any human eye can actually keep up with. We're at well over $15 trillion of national debt, which I believe is a good 6 to 8 trillion higher than it was when this administration started in Washington, D.C. And so we've seen a rapid growth in debt. In fact, I think that if you took all the national debt from George Washington's time to George W. Bush's time, you'd be about where we're at today under Obama's watch in the White House over the last few years. And so you can see how much the debt has really gotten out of control. Of course, we at the state level fare a little bit better. Of course, some states are better than others at balancing their budgets. Hawaii is maybe not as profligate as some states like California, but then again, we'll get into this in Rich States, Poor States. We rank the 50 states based on what they're doing financially, their economic outlook, and Hawaii ranks in the bottom 5 out of the 50 states in the economic outlook because of taxes, regulation, and labor policy, and we'll walk all through that. And then another publication I wanted to raise your attention, I didn't bring hard copies tonight, but you can go to the website and get this. This is the State Budget Reform Toolkit. This is a guide for taxpayers and legislators alike that, if you want to reform your state budget process and, if you have a deficit, here's how to balance the budget without raising taxes. And there's about 25 concrete solutions that we've found have worked in other places to be able to get the budget under control without going back to taxpayers and actually asking for more. So my background is I'm a tax economist. And we've got a very good crowd here tonight because sometimes when I announce I'm a tax economist, people just head to the exits in droves. So evidently you're interested in the what we have to talk about tonight, and I appreciate that. I come from the Tax Foundation before I came to ALEC. I worked as an economist there, and that was the predecessor really to Lowell Capital as a group, the Tax Foundation of Hawaii. It was a national tax foundation, started in 1937. And I was there, not in 1937, I was there for a couple of years, and then came over to ALEC about 5 years ago. And so this issue of economic competitiveness is quite personal to me. They always say a picture tells, speaks 1,000 words. And you see at the cover of Rich States, Poor States here is a city very close to my hometown, Detroit, Michigan. My hometown, Saginaw, Michigan. Anybody here familiar with Saginaw, Michigan? Never been there? We got a couple of people there. That's a town that is, I'm still proud to call it a hometown, but that's a town that's really been through it over the last several decades now. It's only intensified, I think, over the last decade. That was a town that in 1960 had 100,000 population. You know what the population is today? 50,000. It has lost half of its population. 50,000 people have left a small town in the last 50 years. That tells you something has gone greatly wrong in my home city. You look at Detroit, that's a city that was almost 2 million people in 1960. Today it's 700,000. Really a skeleton of itself. It's unbelievable the population loss that they have experienced over the last generation. You hear stories of 10,000 homes being bulldozed down by the city of Detroit because they were attracting bad things going on, drug deals and whatnot. 10,000 homes in one city being bulldozed down because people have moved out. Now, it sort of begs the question, what is this population outflow? What are the causes? Why are people leaving Michigan and other cities in droves? Why are people leaving states in droves? And we really do, since the 1950s, we've talked about the concept of people voting with their feet, right? People voting against certain policies and going to some place where people, have a better outlook and maybe they have a job waiting for themselves in some other place. And really that movement of people between the states is very fascinating. If you look at census numbers, for tax economist geeks such as myself, Christmas comes early usually, the week or two before Christmas, when the Census Department dumps their data projections from the year. And so that is an extremely interesting way of taking a look at where people are moving. And since we have the 2010 census where we do the reapportionment and redistricting of congressional lines, we have some very interesting stories to tell on where people have been moving over the last 10 years. So, the big winner is Texas. Texas, believe it or not, has gained 4 congressional seats over the last 10 years alone. It's unbelievable, that population boom that Texas has received because of their generally free market, pro-growth, pro-business jobs policies that they've enacted. Or in many cases, the best policy that you can do is not to mess with the private sector in the first place, of course. It's not that government creates jobs, it's that the government gets out of the way of the private sector enough for the private sector to do what it's supposed to do. And it seems to be working very well in Texas. Now, Texas, believe it or not, has more Fortune 500 companies located within its borders than New York does. And this just happened for the first time in history a couple of years back. And so we see a real new renaissance of businesses and jobs in Texas. Another very interesting first time in history type story is California. For the first time since its statehood and since the census of 1850, this has been the first time that California has not gained a congressional seat in the round of redistricting that's happening after the 2010 census. Why is that? Population flows have slowed. Believe it or not, if you look at net domestic migration, which is basically taking a look at where Americans are moving in between states, California has a deficit of 1.5 million Americans in the last decade that have chosen to leave California and gone to one of the other 49 states. Now, if that doesn't tell you a lesson of what's wrong in policymaking, really Sacramento has become liberalism's laboratory over the last maybe 20 to 30 years. And any type of program that the left would like to enact, Sacramento has basically been the first, or one of the first, to enact it. And so we have very interesting stories coming out of California these days as well. Now, before I came, I read a very disturbing headline. And I read Senator Sam Sloan here, a small business newsletter that he sends me on a monthly basis. One of the headlines was, "State in dire financial condition." Now that could apply to the other 49 states as well, of course. In fact, Arthur Laffer and I joked around recently that we may need to rename rich states, poor states, a new title, Poor States, Poorer States, right? Because of the financial condition across the states. So that's not unique to Hawaii. However, when I looked and saw that Hawaii taxpayers owe $25,000 each for past debt, and plus $8,872 per year for state expenditures in the current budget, that is an extremely alarming statistic, especially when you look at a state with a very limited tax base. You don't have Texas's millions of population to make up for the fact that you have a shortfall and unfunded liabilities in your pension systems. Now, Sheila Weinberg was here, I guess, recently, and I'm sure she went through the details on the health of or lack of health and financial situation here. Probably, and maybe even geekier details than I would get into, but she was great. She knows this stuff inside and out, and so I'm sure she laid out that problem. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the pension issue. So I think when we talk about state budgets, this has been something that's been in the news across the 50 states. Of course, we heard about California. California was issuing IOUs Now, this is not a joke. Some people think, oh yeah, right, California's issuing IOUs. They were issuing pieces of paper to taxpayers who were due a refund, but they said, oh, we'll pay you later. And they were issuing these IOU forms. Now, I would not say it's great advice for me to say to you that you tell California to wait another 6 months for your tax payment, or you tell the state of Hawaii to wait another 6 months. They would probably not look on that all that favorably. Now, they do it to the taxpayers. They did it a couple years ago. They also did it to state vendors, people that were doing contracts with the state of California. They said, we'll just pay you later. So they were issuing IOUs. You heard the talk of state bankruptcy even because of California's situation. And that really presented a crisis for many of us in the policy community because we've never really encountered that situation all that much. And I think the last time the state had even discussed with any serious nature state bankruptcy was 1920s. So we had a whole several generations that had gone by without that discussion. There is no provision in the United States Constitution that would take care of a state if it's in receivership. There's no part of U.S. bankruptcy law that governs state bankruptcy. We have municipalities that go bankrupt. We had several in Michigan. Actually, Detroit, if you've seen this in the news, is under this whole new emergency financial manager law that the state of Michigan is working with the city of Detroit. So we have towns that go bankrupt. We just didn't have states, and that's kind of where we were at the 50 states. We were in pretty dire straits. We had the 2010 downturn, which you see a national recovery. Generally, state recovery will lag the national recovery by 1 to 2 years. That's just our historical experience of how the states recover from an economic downturn. And of course, we haven't seen that robust of a recovery at all yet at the national level. With unemployment as high as it is today, we have a long ways to go. And you've probably heard this if you're following the news, but it's interesting to point out that I think the only reason we saw a drop in unemployment rates, as we've seen advertised, I'm sure the administration in D.C. is trumpeting the fact that unemployment rates went down. However, what we saw was a loss of people looking for jobs, which will automatically reduce the unemployment rate. We haven't actually seen any real net job creation. We've just seen people leaving the labor market, which artificially makes it look like we're recovering on a jobs picture. Now, at the state level, of course, we don't have the luxury of being able to print money at the state level, and we have to, 49 of the 50 states, at least have to have some sort of a balanced budget. Now, some state balanced budget amendments, it's useful to know, require this. They require states or governors, the legislators or the governors, to propose a balanced budget, and there the requirement ends. So not all balanced budget requirements are created equally. Some work very well in states. Others, as I just said, in places like California and others, it's really a farce. It's nothing more than just a mockery to say, hey, we're making some exercise at trying to balance the budget, but it's nothing more than that, nothing binding. Now, if you're going to create a real balanced budget, you need something that's going to have teeth, that's going to be binding on state legislators. Now, when it comes to budgeting, of course, the first rule of economics is that we live in a world of scarce resources, right? And economics is all about allocating resources to places where we have a scarcity and, using the free market to do that. Now, the first rule of politics, as you may know, is to disregard the first rule of economics and pretend that we have an unlimited amount of resources. And unfortunately, when it comes to state budget making, as many legislators do not know how to differentiate between needs and wants. And that's really the frank discussion that states need to be going through to prioritize their state budget, and that's why we created the Budget Reform Toolkit. Now, as the famous philosopher Yogi Berra would say, this is like deja vu all over again in terms of where we're at. We have this thing called the business cycle. We have booms and we have busts, and this happens time and time again. However, when many state legislators come into session and the times are good, we always forget about the bust that's going to happen in the future. We don't know when it's going to happen, but we do know that the cycle is going to shift and we're going to go into a time of economic downturn. It may be brief, it may be extended like we're seeing right now, an extended downturn. However, when states come into budget, they don't take that into consideration. And that's something that we're working with states to solve. Now, one thing to mention is the question is often raised, why do we have a budget shortfall in any particular state? And many times, folks will come back and say, well, we have a shortage of tax revenue. We just don't tax enough. And they could even say maybe that tax receipts are down, which sometimes that's legitimately happens when you have an economic downturn, because if you tax sales during a recession, sales go down. During a recession, people's incomes go down, so their income tax revenues actually do come down some. So you do have that. However, the prime driver of state budget shortfalls is the huge increase in state spending we've seen over the last decade. In fact, the statistics that we followed on a 50-state level, believe this is shocking when I saw it, that it actually turned out this way, is that over the last 10 years, state government spending has grown 90% faster than the private sector. That's 90% faster than the private sector. That cannot be sustained, obviously, through an up and down period of the economic cycle and the business cycle that we have. And so anytime somebody says that we have this budget shortfall because we don't tax enough, you have this ammunition to say, well, across the 50 states, state governments have grown that much faster than the private sector. How do you create any type of a state government structure when you're growing that much faster than the actual folks that you depend on to fund your state government operations? So those are a couple of the issues that we are following state budgets right now, and a couple of the trends that we're seeing. I don't know. I mean, a lot of the recovery is going to depend on how quickly the national economy recovers and how soon we see some real private sector growth instead of growth in the federal government payroll. And I think that's going to be the real determinant of how quickly states are able to turn it around. I will mention something about pensions. Sheila, I'm sure, hit this very well, as she always does. But I will talk just briefly about state pension shortfalls. If you think state budget shortfalls are bad, if you think the current budget's bad, it's a drop in the bucket to what's owed out there in state pensions and unfunded liabilities. I'll direct you to a page in Rich States, Poor States here. If you've got it in front of you, turn to page 5. If not, you can look this up afterwards. Basically, official state accounting standards will show up what they call the CAFR statements, the Consolidated Annual Financial Report of the state. And that is basically the state's estimation, however old it may be. Sometimes states are just putting out their 2009 CAFR statements at this point, or 2010 maybe if we're lucky. And they give you an estimate of where the unfunded liabilities they think they are. And right now, what I have, and this may be slightly updated, I think Rick said it actually deteriorated a little bit in the most recent estimate. But what we had at the time of publication here is that Hawaii owed $5.1 billion in unfunded liabilities in the state pension system. Now that's absolutely huge. What's the size of the state budget? Anybody know offhand here in Hawaii? Okay, so I mean, you're looking at a huge shortfall in terms of your overall state budget. That's just in pensions right there.
That's $5 billion.
$5 billion annually. So you're looking at a figure that's absolutely equal to what you spend an entire year on all other government functions. Now that's using, the old saying is, when government says there's a problem, the reality is always somewhat worse. And that is the case certainly when it comes to public pensions. And if you look at this on page 5, we have 2 other alternate analysis that we offer for unfunded liabilities and state pensions. One is from the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C. The other is from 2 professors at Northwestern University in Chicago who do an analysis based on what the private sector would require. Let's say a company is trying to evaluate its unfunded liabilities in its private pension system. Here are the guidelines that FASB, which is the Private Sector Accounting Oversight Board, what they would require them to use. You see what happens to Hawaii's unfunded liability. It goes from $5.1 billion to either 16 or 18 billion. Now, neither one of those scenarios are all that great, but the trend is if you use a private sector valuation for your unfunded liabilities, it's going to be much, much, much worse than advertised under the current government accounting. And why is this the case? I'll explain to you just briefly a couple of the main points on why that's the case. One of the things that state governments do to hide the problem, they may not do this intentionally, but they do it, and that is, what is the required rate of return that they're estimating? Because obviously you're looking at a model of valuation. It all depends on the variables, and it all depends on the human inputs that you're going to have there. One of that, in Hawaii's case, for instance, is that the annual required contribution for the fund to earn is 8%. Now, has anybody here over the last decade averaged 8% in your 401k? Because if you did, I'd like to get you financial advice afterwards from you, because I sure as heck need the help. But to get 8% over the last decade, it's just not out there. It's not possible. But we still assume it. That's just an assumption that state government makes. Now, let's say you were to assume maybe a 6% rate of return, which is what Warren Buffett says that states ought to be doing, and he's no conservative luminary, that's for sure. And what he says is 6%. Now, if you took it to 6%, the unfunded liability explodes. And if you take it to 4%, it gets even larger, obviously. Now, politicians will not do this generally because it would require a large payment in the current budget, which they call the annually required contribution. That payment just balloons if you actually properly value and properly use the properly rated return, I should say, for these pension funds. The other issue is that, believe it or not, even though the stock market crashed in 2008, many state pension funds are not even realizing the brunt of the losses yet on their official books. This is because government accounting standards, which are very flexible, let's put it that way. If you're in the private sector, many folks would probably end up in jail if they signed off on their financial reports at this type of accounting. What the governments do is they are, in many cases, not even showing on their books yet a percentage of what was lost in 2008. That's because they have this technique known as asset smoothing, which is what they call it. That's a fancy actuarial word for it, which is basically just ignoring your losses until a later date. And so in some cases, states are only realizing maybe 40 to 60% of the losses that were incurred in the fall of 2008. Now, some state pension funds lost between 20 to 30% of their entire asset value during that tragic fall of 2008, during the stock market crash. So we're seeing a huge percentage of unfunded liabilities that may not even be on the books yet. Those are a couple of reasons why the unfunded liabilities are much worse than advertised. I encourage you to maybe reach out to your state pension fund administrator and ask him, what's your required rate of return? If it's 8%, have you thought about reducing it to more of a sustainable level? Because I think we're living under a fantasy land here if we don't actually properly take a look at how to value these things. And one of the things that we've seen as a solution is that, this isn't all about doom and gloom, because we actually do have some great ideas across the 50 laboratories of democracy on what's working and what states are doing to address these problems. I think that's useful to mention. My home state of Michigan, for instance, back in 1997, actually undertook, we were well ahead of our time in 97 under Governor John Engler at the time, and one of the ALEC founders, by the way. He became governor in the 90s and actually put all new state employees into defined contribution pension funds in 1997. Now, the naysayers out there would say, well, that's not going to get you any savings if you just put new employees. But you know what? He drew a line in the sand and said, we cannot continue to kick the can down the road, and let's get this done now for new employees. And you know what? Since 1997 to today, there was a report done from an independent actuary that said Michigan has saved $4.3 billion in its unfunded liabilities because it undertook the reform in 1997. And that was just for new hires. The big money savings is for retirees and for people that are vested in the system. But that's not a group that you really want to go after, either for moral or contractual reasons. You don't really want to promise somebody a full retirement and then take it away from them after the fact. That's not something I don't think many people are comfortable with doing. However, what is a no-brainer is we cannot continue to operate under the old system any longer. New hires must go into defined contribution plans, which is what the private sector had to do, 10, 20 years ago? We saw a huge movement of private sector employees into these type of 401k plans. Everybody's got 401k plans now. And what that does for taxpayers is it caps, it adds that certainty to taxpayers. It caps the amount that the state is on the hook for and liable for going forward. And Michigan did it. In 2010, the state of Utah undertook this reform. One of my friends, who's a senator, Senator Dan Lillienquist, he's now running for the United States Senate, was chairman of the pension committee, and said, we lost so much in the fall of 2008. And Utah was a state that was almost at the top of the line in terms of how well they had funded their pension system prior to the crash of 2008. And what he said was, we found out that we would need to devote 10% of our state budget to the pension fund over the next 25 years just to pay off the losses of the fall of 2008. That's how large of a payment it would take, and what it would mean to the other government programs there, and what it would mean to potentially taxes going through the roof in Utah if they didn't address this. So they came together, Republicans and Democrats alike. They even sat down with public employee unions and said, hey, if you want to guarantee the future stability of your fund for your retirees, you're going to sit down at the negotiating table and talk about this reform for new hires. And they got it done. And they passed a very comprehensive pension reform in Utah. It's going to save taxpayers, billions over the long term. Now, the critic may say, well, Utah is the most conservative state in the country. It probably gave John McCain 70% of its vote in the last presidential election. How do you expect a state that's a middle-of-the-road state or a blue state, like Hawaii, for instance, to ever undertake this type of reform? Well, one thing is, you can do it in Michigan. Michigan is not necessarily the most friendly place for free market ideas if you've been following Michigan for a while. It's a very strong union state, but they said, financial reality is not negotiable. They got ahead of the curve, and they really have avoided becoming a basket case like Illinois with its state pensions, and Sheila's from Illinois, so she told you that story. Now, the other really retort to that is that just about 3 months ago, the state of Rhode Island, which is not known as a bastion of conservatism, of course. Maybe, here, Senator Sam Sloan, a good friend, is one Republican out of 25 senators in the Hawaii Senate. The lowest ratio of Republicans anywhere in the country in the state legislative body. Probably the second lowest amount of Republicans in the legislative body comes in Rhode Island, when I think there's only maybe 3 or 4 Republican senators in the entire state of Rhode Island. Now, Rhode Island enacted a fundamental pension reform. They brought together a huge Democrat majority in their state legislature. They brought together an independent governor, Lincoln Chafee, former U.S. Senator, who's now an independent elected governor, as well as a Democrat state treasurer, who all came together and said, this is not negotiable. This type of financial crisis knows no political affiliation. This is something that we must get done for the future health of our state, for our taxpayers, and they did. So Rhode Island, 3 months ago, enacted a major pension reform to protect their taxpayers. So if you can do it in Rhode Island, there is hope for Hawaii, and there is hope for other blue and other middle-of-the-road states across the country. Now, I think with that, I wanted to move on a little bit to what some of the other things we're following in rich states, poor states, of the competitiveness aspect of tax policy and what we're seeing in terms of what type of policies matter for growth across the states. One of the things that we do is, we follow the 50 laboratories, but one of the things you do learn after studying policy for a while is sometimes you learn as much from what not to do as you learn from what to do. As the old saying goes, everybody serves some purpose in life, even if it's telling you not to tell you not to do. So I mean, it's very very instructive to say, let's not follow the federal government's failure on tax policy. That's something that we can all agree on. Let me just read to you. This is a very interesting column that Steve Forbes put together this recently that I took a look at and kind of judges where federal tax policy is. Now, the federal tax code is such a mess that, in perspective, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, which defined the character of the American nation, is only 272 words. The Declaration of Independence is 1,500 words. The Constitution, with all of its amendments, is 7,200 words. And the Bible, which took centuries to put together, is 773,000 words. Now, the Federal Income Tax Code, and all of its attendant rules and regulations, is almost 10 million words today and rising at a very, very rapid pace. In fact, since the last major tax reform in 1986, the federal tax code has been changed 14,000 times. That tells you something of what not to do in terms of tax policy. The cost now, the IRS calculates at least, that we spend 6 billion hours a year filling out tax forms as Americans, which is the equivalent of almost 3 million full-time jobs. And the Tax Foundation, the organization I used to work for, does an estimate on what that costs the average, or it costs the economy in terms of lost productivity. And that cost of compliance is now $483 billion a year that we lose as a deadweight loss cost to our national economy because of our complex, out-of-date tax code. Now, a tax code ought to look like somebody designed it on purpose. Ours does not at the federal level. At the state level, it's somewhat better. What we find is states are all over the map, obviously. You have states like Hawaii, which has now the highest personal income tax in the country, at 11%, tied with Oregon. You have California, which has obviously got its problems, almost that high. New York and other states very close. On the other hand, you have some states that are very much more favorable tax treatment. You have flat tax states, many states that are low rate flat tax. But the group of states that I want to talk about a little bit tonight is the states without income taxes. There are, believe it or not, 9 states across the country without income taxes. And they actually are very, they vary quite a bit actually in terms of their geography and in terms of kind of their state background. You have everything from Alaska, you have Washington State, you have Nevada, all different in their own right, but the differences keep on going. You look at Texas, you look at Wyoming, you look at South Dakota, you look at Tennessee, New Hampshire, Florida. You have a very different group of states out there, but the one thing that they do have in common is they do not tax personal income at the state level. Now, let me run through some examples on how much we think taxes matter at the state level in terms of state income taxes. And of course, this does not bode well for Hawaii being at the wrong end of that list. Now, one of the things we take a look at when we analyze state policy is gross state product growth. We take a look at personal income growth, look at job growth, you look at tax receipt growth, and maybe you look at population growth. There's all measures of success across the states. And we take a look every year in this report, and we update it, is the 9 states without personal income taxes, compare those with the 9 states that have the highest marginal tax rates. And we take a look at their growth over the last 10 years. Now, if you look at gross state product growth, the states with the highest income taxes have about 45% gross state product growth over the last 10 years. The states without personal income taxes have over 60% GSP growth over the last 10 years, which is significant. You take a look at population growth. As I mentioned, people vote with their feet. Now, they're voting very strongly in favor of the states without income taxes. You look at 6.5% population growth in the states with the highest income taxes, but almost 14% population growth in the states without income taxes. Now you take a look down and you see job growth numbers. It's a less than 0.5% job growth in the states with the highest income taxes over 10 years. I mean, that's some pretty anemic statistics there, not even 0.5% job growth. You look at the states without income taxes, almost 8% growth in jobs over the last 10 years. It's almost like no recession happened. Those states are just plowing right through, and in some cases like Texas, just booming and leading the way. Now, the last piece of this is what is happening with total tax receipt growth, because maybe one of the criticisms could be that, oh, well, the states without income taxes, how in the world do they fund government operations then? So the total state tax receipt growth was 60% in the states with the highest income taxes over the last 10 years. The tax receipt growth with the states without income tax was double, 120% tax receipt growth over 10 years in the states without income taxes. Now, how could this be? This kind of shatters the whole liberal worldview of tax policy, is that the liberal worldview is you must raise taxes to raise revenue. You must raise rates to raise revenue, right? That's what you hear. If you have a budget shortfall, what do? Raise rates. You're going to get more revenue. Unfortunately, they neglect some very basic economics. And that's something that one of my co-authors, Arthur Laffer, pioneered. That is the Laffer curve. Now, who all remembers the Laffer curve from Economics 101? I won't call on you, that's all right, but we have a good amount of folks that did. Now, the basics of the Laffer curve. Now, some on the left have demonized this as voodoo economics or, various other pejorative terms of why supply-side economics is supposedly, wacky of some sort. But let's take a look at its basic concept. At a 0% tax rate, how much revenue do you raise for the government? That's the easy part, right? You raise 0 revenue for the government on that tax when you have a 0% rate. That's easy. On the other hand, if you have a 100% tax rate, how much revenue do you raise for the government?
0.
0, right? Because who here wants to work for the privilege of paying taxes to the government? basically what the Laffer curve tells us is that people will change their behavior based on tax policy. That tax policy matters just like any other incentive matters. But taxes are a direct disincentive to whatever they're taxing. When the old saying is, when you tax something, you get less of it. When you tax something less, you get more of it. So if you're taxing, let's say income, for instance, do you want more income or less income? So generally, these type of tax policy incentives play a very large role. We don't know exactly. It depends on the type of tax, the locations, what other competing states or nations are doing as to what the effect would be. But at the bottom line, it's very hard to argue against the power of the Laffer curve in this case to demonstrate human behavior changing based on tax policy. And so the key to Texas and the states that are growing their revenue so quickly, even without an income tax, is they're not raising their revenue through raising rates. They're raising their revenue through growing their tax base by attracting more people to their state. And it actually has been a very lucrative approach for them to actually raise revenue. And that's really the Texas success story, is that even though they're not charging a state income tax, you know what? 4 congressional seats of people, that's about 3 million or so that have moved into Texas over the last 10 years. Those people are not paying income taxes, but you know what? They're all paying property taxes, they're all paying sales taxes, they're paying all the other taxes that fund the government of Texas. And they're doing it very well, and that's really one of the experiences that we see. I think one of the most important variables for growth that we analyze is the state marginal personal and business income tax. Now, there is a group on the left, I don't know if any of you have heard of them, Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. And they have groups across the 50 states to try to tell people that taxes don't matter. And that what they came out with a recent report that says that weather matters more than taxes for growth. Now, I really wish that there was a joke. Anybody follow the Onion newspaper in Washington, always coming up with the satirical news? I really hope there's an Onion newspaper headline because, nobody really says that with a straight face. The weather is great, but when it comes to having a job or not having a job, people go where the jobs are. And what we find a very strong correlation is that the jobs go where there's least resistance. Is the old saying, I think Jack Kemp maybe coined it, is capital is a coward. It doesn't go where it's not wanted. And when we have 50 different laboratories that all are competing for the same amount of human and investment capital, it's pretty clear where people are going, and those states are reaping the rewards. And of course, you have this experience here in Hawaii. You have great weather. I understand that Oahu by itself lost 50,000 people over the last 10 years. California, of course, as I mentioned, they've lost 1.5 million Americans over the last 10 years. And people are voting with their feet, and they continue to do so. One of the things is, the criticisms of this analysis may say that you're only taking cherry-picking data and saying, well, right now that relationship may be true, that low-tax states are doing better than high-tax states, but what about the past? Well, for one, we take a 10-year look back, so it's a fairly broad look back. However, if you take a 50-year look back or a 60-year look back and go back a half a century worth of data, the no-income tax states, and that group of states has changed over that 50 years. It's not always been the 9 states. Of course, 50 years ago, there were 20 states without a personal income tax. Now, if you take a look at that grouping of states and compare it with the states with the highest income taxes, over all of those 50 years, that relationship exists, that the no-income tax states always outperform the states with the highest tax rates. And actually, in rich states, poor states, we do a little bit of analysis on the 11 states that have enacted an income tax over the last 50 years. And we take a look at their performance pre-income tax and their performance post-income tax. And across the board, those 11 states that have adopted an income tax over that half century have all fallen off in terms of economic growth and vitality, including my home state of Michigan that created an income tax in the late 60s. So I think I probably hit the income tax piece fairly well. I'll probably beat that horse into the ground. But I wanted to talk a little bit briefly about what else we're seeing out there and then open it up for some questions and answers. And hopefully we'll be able to have a good informal discussion when it comes to that and get your thoughts on what's going on. Now, with Hawaii, as I mentioned, you rank in the bottom 5 nationally in economic outlook. And let me direct you to this page in Rich States, Poor States, and tell you to take a look at it. It's page 60 in your book. And this is, in the last 50 pages of the book, we do one page per state to analyze where that state is, both in performance in the past and also what we judge is their outlook, or that's our forecast, or where we think the state economy is headed. And Hawaii, is not a bright spot when it takes a look at economic outlook. And in fact, even since 2008, you've deteriorated 5 additional spots and now find yourself in the bottom 5. And what we rank, we have 15 variables that we use to come up with this competitiveness index: taxes, regulation, and labor policy. So as you can see, 11% state income tax, one of the highest in the country. Another thing that goes there against you is the sales or GET here, which how many times have you heard somebody from the mainland say, well, Hawaii has a low sales tax, it's only 4 point something, so he must have a very low sales tax, and gives you credit for it for some reason. Now, that's a pretty short-sighted analysis. If you take a look at the collections, obviously, I see a lot of nodding heads. You all know because you pay it, and you pay it in the embedded cost of goods that you might not even know about. Costs are higher here, and that's one of the reasons. If you look at it that way, you're second highest in the country in terms of your sales tax collections. And so that's a big determining factor. Obviously, having an estate inheritance tax is a big issue for wealthy residents that may want to go to a place that they're not going to have to hand over an additional percentage of their estates to the government and not be able to pass them on to their kids. You have recently enacted tax increases over the last couple of years that have put you in the bottom 5 or 6 states there in terms of the states that have raised taxes the most as a percentage of their income tax base. And then, of course, you have the issue of not being a right-to-work state, which we find is quite an important variable out there for competitiveness. There are several states, including, as we talk here this week in Hawaii, the state of Indiana is very close to enacting a right-to-work law, which would be the first time that an industrial Midwestern state were to enact a right-to-work law, which is basically the ability of an employee to work in a unionized industry without being a member of the union. And that's something that we think is pretty critical to worker freedom, but also when we talk to job creators out there, businesses, they say that if we're looking to locate, many of them, if we're choosing among states to locate our new facility, we will not even consider a state for development of that facility unless it's a right-to-work state. That's what many of the businesses will tell us. So there are certainly some places here for Hawaii to improve. That's not a problem that you have, is trying to pinpoint one place to improve. You've got a few. And so your work is certainly cut out ahead of you. So I think with that, the beauty of the American experiment, from my perspective, is that we do have these 50 laboratories of democracy. It's a fascinating job to be able to go across the 50 states to see what policies are working and where not. But the beauty of it is that you get to choose which path you're going to follow. You get to choose whether you're going to follow the California, the New York, the Illinois model that has failed pretty badly in many of those states where people are leaving, businesses are leaving. Or, you can choose the Texas model, the model for growth. It's really, I think, the conflict of visions. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Thomas Sowell book by that title. And it's really a choice between the live free or die mentality of New Hampshire, which they love that. I go and give a speech in New Hampshire a few times a year. And if you really want to get a New Hampshire crowd riled up, all you need to do is say, glad to be here in the live free or die state, and they all applaud, and they're very, very proud of that. That's been their governing philosophy. They do not have an income tax, and believe it or not, they don't have a sales tax either. They keep government small. Their legislators make $100 a year is their legislative salary. They hand it all over to ALEC because our legislative dues for our members are $100 a year. And believe it or not, I've heard it a time or two that they're not all that happy about handing over their yearly paycheck to join ALEC. And they will remind you that after federal income taxes, they're getting $87 a year. And so that's their motto, though, and it works very well. It's a freedom-loving motto. To keep government small, to empower citizens, to empower the private sector, and they're a competitive place, and they've grown much better. Some people say, well, it's a disease of New England, it's a dying region. No, it's not. New Hampshire has outpaced every one of its high-tax brethren. Sometimes I like to refer to New Hampshire as a light in the sea of darkness up there in the Northeast. On the other hand, you have this philosophy of Ronald Reagan warned us of this philosophy years ago, where he said their philosophy, on the other hand, is if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. If it stops moving, subsidize it. And that's been the governing approach of California, the states, the failed states out there today. And this is a big problem. Not only the taxing part, but the subsidization of failed industry part. And of course, we know all about that in Washington, D.C. with CARB and everything else that we're bailing out failed industries and the Wall Street bailouts. We know a thing or two about how to do that. Anybody here know of a company called Solandra, of course. That's been in the news. I mean, that highlights exactly what government shouldn't be in the business of doing, and that is picking winners and losers. And that's the approach of states that are, these states that have gone down the wrong path. But, we have a great experiment that we have in this country, and we get to choose which path and which vision that we're going to follow. So that's why I want to encourage you to stay active, because, the thing that the people on the other side of these issues in Washington, D.C., the thing they want you to do most is go home and not get together and not care and not read the publications and not stay abreast of what's happening in D.C., but also in your state capital. They think that, I believe this, because they think that the Tea Party is a one-hit wonder. They're going to be around for one election cycle, and it's just going to go back to the usual same old, same old. They've got their own version of the Tea Party, their Occupy movement now, that they think is going to be the next cycle, and they think that the unions and the Soros guys are going to come out, and the Tea Party is just going to go away. That's the danger, is that even though the Tea Party helped inspire a new conservative group in Washington in the House of Representatives, the Senate and the presidency, two out of the three branches there, or I should say the legislative executive branches, are controlled by tax and spend liberals for the most part. The Supreme Court is teetering on the edge, and of course that's one of the most powerful. But we are far from accomplishing everything that needs to be accomplished. And it makes me feel good to see groups, even in a place that's not a highly populated place here, a beautiful place, but you lack in population, you make up in beauty here. But it's important they stay involved. If you need any case in point, look at the Iowa caucuses from a couple of weeks ago. How many votes separated the top three candidates there? That's how much a small group of people matters. And let's make sure that the people in D.C. get it wrong, and that the Tea Party will not be a one-hit wonder, that you'll stay active. This is not a partisan thing. This is not left or right. Republicans have gone astray in many cases as well. But this is an issue of up or down for the future of this state and the future of the country. And with that, I really encourage you to stay active. Thank you, Rick, for putting this together, and thank you for all you're doing. Hawaii currently faces a major financial crisis. We find every citizen here of Hawaii faces a $25,000 liability. And there's big questions as to why this exists, and there's big questions on how Hawaii can go forward. And the subject of this was something I recently talked about here with the Kona Tea Party about my research at Rich States, Poor States, which is an annual publication my organization does with Dr. Arthur Laffer, who is Ronald Reagan's economist, and Steve Moore from the Wall Street Journal. And we analyze how states are faring in these uncertain financial times across the country today. And unfortunately, the news is not all that rosy for the state of Hawaii. In our economic outlook rankings, where we analyze the future competitiveness of states, Hawaii ranks in the bottom 5, number 46 out of the 50 states today. And so legislators in Honolulu and across the state need to be asking some pretty fundamental questions on how to make Hawaii competitive again. And I think one of the first things on that list should be, how do we reform state budget here to make it more efficient in delivering core services to taxpayers while not running up the credit cards and continuing to borrow and continuing to run up debt on Hawaii taxpayers. One of the things that has worked in other states in our 50 laboratories of democracy is the concept of priority-based budgeting. That is, helping the government to live within its means by deciding between needs and wants. And this is something Washington State was able to do under Democrat and Republican leadership about 10 years ago when they closed a $3 billion budget shortfall without raising taxes by a dime. And they did this by properly prioritizing state government functions and by saying, what are the things that state government needs to do in order to be effective? What are the things that the state constitution provides that we must do? And what are the things that our taxpayers and citizens are requiring from state government? And then taking a look at the other areas of state government and functions to say, maybe we ought to think about scaling this down or eliminating these functions if they're not providing value for our citizens, just like any business needs to provide value to its customers to stay alive. State governments really are starting to look at the need to produce value for its taxpayers, and this is one way that Hawaii can get its budget back under control and start to eliminate the need for future tax increases. Because right now Hawaii is not competitive when it comes to tax policy. In fact, in terms of personal income taxes, which we think are some of the biggest determinators of the future growth among the states, Hawaii has the highest income tax in the country today at the state level, 11% personal income tax. And of course, many of Hawaii's small businesses pay their taxes on the personal income tax side, facing this highest tax bill in America right now, tied with the state of Oregon at 11%. And so that needs to be re-examined as well. If we're to bring businesses and new entrepreneurs and startups here and wanting to do business in the state of Hawaii, Hawaii needs to be more competitive with its personal income tax rates, competitive with other states. Its capital, whether it's human capital or investment capital, has many decisions on where it can be located. It does not go where it's not wanted. And that's one of the key stories, is that we do have 50 laboratories of democracy that people can choose where to live. They're voting with their feet. They're voting with their dollars. And people go where the jobs are. That's why we see across the country so many states that are successful today are states that are keeping taxes low and they're getting government spending under control. Take a look at the state of Texas. This is one model. This is the live free or die model of today, being that we're no income tax and also keeping government out of the lives of its citizens. They've attracted almost 3 million people over the last 10 years into the state of Texas that have moved in to seek a better life for themselves and their family. Taking a look at case studies like this and what's working in the states is very valuable. Also, the problems of my state, home state of Michigan, where my town has shrunk by 50% over the last 45 years. It's a state where there were no jobs for college graduates that went through our fine K-12 education systems and graduated even from our fine research institutions at the four-year college level, but did not have jobs. They went to places that had jobs. And Michigan, in some cases, has educated the future residents of places like Texas where they're going to get jobs. And if Hawaii wants to avoid the mistakes of my home state of Michigan and actually learn from some of the success that we've seen in places like Texas, it needs to examine what policies have worked and what policies have not. And we hope that our resource, Rich States, Poor States, which can be viewed as a free PDF download at ALEC.org, can be used as a great resource for your taxpayers across the state of Hawaii to make Hawaii a more competitive state.